We are delighted that this episode of Starts at the Top is sponsored by Avato Connect. Avato Connect is a socially conscious customer experience and business optimization partner for organisations who are ready to reshape and reinvent how they work and connect with those who matter most. They develop and deliver innovative, technology-led solutions to enable their clients to form stronger connections, increase loyalty, create efficiencies, and ultimately grow and confidently embrace the future. To find out more about how Avato Connect could help an organisation like yours and to receive a free, no-obligation chat, visit their website, avatoconnect.co.uk.
If you always do what you've always done, you're going to get the same results. So in other words, you need to do something differently. And it always has to start with your why.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. I'm Zoe Amma.
And I'm Paul Thomas. Our podcast exists to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption, but we soon realised that leaders were telling us something more important and urgent about how traditional ways of leading had changed forever.
So we make it our mission to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, and we cover topics ranging from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and climate change. Basically, all the subjects that today's leaders need to be across in 2024.
Our podcast isn't about shiny case studies, it's about lessons learned and progress made the hard way, and crucially, how that can inspire others.
On this episode, we're sharing our conversation with Aggie Mutuma, CEO of Mahogany Inclusion Partners, a boutique consultancy that offers tailored solutions to organisations exploring inclusion and racial equity strategies.
Aggie's work involves collaborating with executive leadership teams to implement comprehensive DEI and anti-racism strategies. So it was with great interest that we read the latest Parker Review report issued this week. And the Parker Review, just to give it a bit of background, and we will share links in the show notes, is an independent framework made up of a group of volunteer business professionals who each bring a wide range of gender and ethnically diverse perspectives. In the 7 years since the publication of the first report into ethnic diversity of UK boards in 2017, some, let's call it steady progress, has been made. So the 2024 review says that there are now 12 ethnic minority chief executives in the FTSE 100, and this is up from 7 in 2022. However, overall, only 13% of senior management in FTSE 100 firms were classed as ethnically diverse. Also, people with ethnic minority backgrounds now hold 19% of all director positions. That's just a rise of 1 percentage point from last year. So it's a change, but in the right direction, but it's not a big change. And for the first time, the Parker Review also gathered information on board representation from the 50 largest private companies in the UK. It found that less than half, that's about 44% of those businesses, had an ethnic minority director on their board. But we do need to state here that only 36 of the 50 companies the review contacted responded, so it hopes to receive a greater number of responses in future reports. So there's clearly much more that we need to do to improve diversity in the business world. So Zoe, how does this compare to the charity sector?
Yeah, so there's some not dissimilar trends here in some ways. So I think generally my reflection would be, before we talk about the hard numbers, is that, and this very much led to our need to speak to someone with Aggie's expertise, that is there quite the same momentum around the drive for inclusion that there once was? Obviously, you and I know, and many people listening to this podcast will know, it is still a very urgent issue, but that is not reflected in the numbers that we're seeing. So if we think about the research we've seen from Akivo, which was back towards the end of 2023. So they did a piece of research which showed that the proportion of charity leaders from Black, Asian and minoritized ethnic backgrounds had remained at 7% for the second year running. And actually there was some really shocking stats on other areas of representation as well. So one of the things that they saw was that the number of Black charity CEOs fell to below 1%. So that's from Akivo's research in October 2023. So pretty shocking stuff there. So everyone's talking about these kinds of issues, but yet we're not seeing the change really feeding through into representation. And Jane Ide, who is the CEO of Akivo, who we've had on this podcast, actually, as many people might recall, said that she was disappointed and frustrated by the findings of that study. So great work from Akivo, flagging that lack of representation. Great that they're keeping this issue firmly on the sector's radar. And obviously there's a lot more work to be done in this area by people who are hiring charity professionals and charity leaders.
Yeah, and I guess one thing we ought to say is that we try to be across the private, public and third sector. So we haven't got much on the public sector in this intro, but what we'll do is we'll have a look and see see if we can find something on the latest stats, and we'll share that in the show notes as well, just for fairness and parity.
Absolutely. It's always interesting to see those points of comparison, isn't it? I guess what I take away from the data we've seen here from the private sector and also the charity sector is clearly this is an issue that lots of organisations are struggling with it, even if they might not admit that publicly. There's basically a gap between words and action, isn't there? That's the fundamental challenge here. And it's a very topical subject for today, actually, because as we're recording this Wednesday, there's obviously a lot of stuff going on in the news around inclusion and how people talk about marginalised groups in government. And indeed, this is an issue which all the political parties seem to be feeling their way through at the moment. No one seems to be immune from this challenge. We've seen a lot of stories of this nature over the last few months. And obviously Parliament is a workplace like any other. And I think there's this fundamental question here of what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, what does redemption look like, what does forgiveness look like, where do we draw the line, where do we call things out? And that's, I think, one of the things leading to a lot of tension at the moment.
Yeah, and Aggie touched on some of that in the conversation that we had, so looking forward to sharing that. We ought to also make the point that this is an annual report, so we make a note in the diary for this time next year when we're introducing a podcast. Hopefully we're seeing a big shift in an upwards direction, but it seems to me that it's going to be continual baby steps. It's going to be small shifts in the numbers and not huge. But we'll see. Maybe the public sector numbers will surprise us.
Absolutely. Well, we will see what we can find on that front.
So now for our interview with Aggie Mutuma.
We are very excited to welcome the wonderful Aggie Mutuma to the podcast today. Aggie is CEO of Mahogany Inclusion Partners. She's a multiple award-winning leader and the CEO of Mahogany Inclusion Partners. With remarkable expertise in inclusion and anti-racism, she is a passionate advocate, executive leadership coach and engaging speaker, dedicated to fostering thriving cultures within organisations. Her achievements have earned her recognition as a top 20 most influential HR thinker in 2022, as voted by her peers. Aggie's impactful work involves collaborating with executive leadership teams to implement comprehensive DEI and anti-racism strategies. Her clients span a wide range of industries, including global FTSE 100 organisations, consultancy firms, retailers, as well as third sector and public sector entities. Utilising a combination of strategic thinking and compassionately challenging coaching methods, Aggie guides Exco teams and their organisations through transformational change, cultivating psychologically safe spaces that encourage behaviour change and the development of inclusive cultures. Renowned as a trusted advisor for the CIPD, Aggie is also a captivating speaker who has spoken at prestigious events such as the CBI and the CIPD annual conference. Aggie, it's a joy to have you here. Thank you so much for coming on Starts at the Top.
Thank you for having me, Zoe. It's great to be here.
Oh, well, we're delighted to have you here. Thank you so much for making the time. And we're especially pleased to be talking to you because we're hearing all kinds of contradictory, fascinating things about the state of play with EDI and organisations through our networks. Obviously, EDI should still be the same urgent priority that it always was. But given things like the cost of living and all the other challenges that are going on at the moment, do you think organisations are losing focus on EDI? Are they as committed to it as they once were? What's your take on what's currently happening?
Yeah, great question, Zoe. It's definitely a conversation that's been had by a lot of people in the people space and definitely in the EDI space. And I guess I see two questions. Are they losing focus? And then is potentially the commitment waning? And I would say losing focus, yes, that's a definite. And what I would say to that is that I've had about 2.5 decades experience in the people space. So prior to my time in EDI, or my focus on EDI through Mahogany Inclusion Partners, I've led people teams for organizations like Tesco Stores Limited, McDonald's restaurants, etc. And what I know to be true is that anytime there's an economic challenge or downturn, any people activities do get defunded and deprioritized. So whether that's recruitment, you'll see recruitment freezes, won't you? You'll see that training's been cut. You'll see that potentially organizations are downsizing and making redundancies. So the fact that DEI is part of those people programs will have an impact on DEI. So I think an element of what we're perceiving potentially as a lack of commitment, or what we're experiencing as a lack of focus, is going to be due to that. Just the cyclical nature of economy, and then the impact on business, and therefore the impact on people, activities, and strategies. And then in terms of the commitment question, I would also say yes, to a degree, and I'll add that caveat to a degree. My assumption, and it's also based on conversations as well, or my view is that at the beginning of our conversation, the big wave of conversation around DEI, so I'm going to say about 3, maybe 4-ish years ago, there was a lot of activity around awareness and, wow, we didn't know there was such huge issues. And yes, we do need to do something differently. And yes, we do need to think about inclusion in our organizations. So the beautiful intent was there, because most of us are values-driven individuals. What organizations and leaders started to understand as they sort of delved into DEI was a lot of the changes needed are wholesale structural changes and cultural changes. It isn't just an awareness webinar that will fix everything. It isn't just a tweak of the website that will fix everything. It's actually about how we engage with each other, those moments of truth, and also what our systems and processes are. So as organizations realize the gravity and the extent of the work that needs to be done, some are rather put off by it, or others are kind of stuck and thinking, I don't know where to start and how do I do this? So I think there's an element of that as well, that realization of how much work there is potentially, but also forgetting the outcomes and forgetting the benefits, and forgetting the beauty of diversity, inclusion, and really great cultures and workplaces.
Wow, thank you, Aggie. That's such a interesting take on the state of play, and a worrying one as well, because obviously that underlying need for us all to be more inclusive and to do the work to make our organisations more inclusive is still there, right?
Definitely still there. And even if we were to park DEI just for a moment, my advice has always been in organizations, even when there is an economic downturn, even when there's a cost of living crisis, that is not the time to cut back on our people priorities. It really isn't. If anything, it's the time to actually focus on them even more, because we know our people are going to be facing challenges. So if we bring back EDI into the conversation, we know that in an economic downturn, certain groups experience that more. So even if we start with social economic backgrounds, those who are from the less privileged social economic backgrounds, they experience economic downturns more. So do women, so do people of colour, many underrepresented groups. So actually DEI is more important. And for some people, work can be that safe space. Work can be that place of, looking after your own well-being, well-being and stepping away from the realities of challenges of life potentially. So again, workplaces have this beautiful opportunity to step in and focus even more on their people. And I would say this is not even just my view. McKinsey recently released their updated Why Diversity Matters. I think it's called Diversity Still Matters, or Diversity Matters Even More, something like that. Essentially, Diversity Matters. And in that report, they also spoke to the fact that at the times of economic downturn, that is when to absolutely focus on inclusion, absolutely focus on your people, because there will be a recovery. And if you think about it, if we're recovering and we've got less people in the organization, they're less engaged, we haven't trained them, we haven't focused on them, then we're not going to be able to maximize the benefits of that recovery as well. So it's almost like, when they say, if it's raining, you're not going to say, I'm not going to fix my roof because it's raining, are you really? Your house is going to get wet. So it's that piece.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And you talked about the scale of the work earlier as well. Do you think some organisations have simply got scared of the extent of soul searching and change that they will need to undertake?
Absolutely. Many organizations, if you look at their values on the websites, they talk about things such as fairness and doing the right thing and everybody's welcome. Most organizations have values that speak to that. And if you speak to most people about their own values, most people have values around doing the right thing, justice, and again, words that sort of are around those themes. So when you talk about diversity, inclusion, and potential discrimination, which does happen in society, it does happen in our organizations as well. People find that quite challenging, and organizations find that challenging. So there is that reticence to engage, to kind of step back from it. And then when organizations start to hear the experiences of their people and understand the experiences of their people, they then understand how big their gaps are potentially. And then there is that sort of, okay, what do we do about it? How do we do it? Is it too huge a problem? So people do become scared, I guess, to use your words, they do become scared when they look at the gravity of the issue.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because one thing I've noticed, I was talking to wonderful Yasmin from your team a few weeks back, is how that conversation about EDI programs in the media seems to have shifted over the last few months, perhaps because we're now all in this run up to this extraordinary swathe of global elections that we're going to be seeing this year. So, for example, there was an article in the Economist, which I was quite surprised was somewhat negative about EDI programs, which is very surprising to see that. Do you think there's a danger during this year that things like EDI programs are going to get weaponized in the culture wars?
Yes, and I think we're seeing it already, aren't we? There's a war on woke and all sorts of things, but we're seeing that, and very high-profile people such as Mr. Elon Musk, saying things such as DEI must die, and interesting, clever play on the words, but not very helpful either. And I think there are many reasons behind that, some which we've spoken about already. And then also, I do believe that some of the ways in which we, and I mean global we, not us on the call clearly, global we have the conversation, it's had in a very moralistic way, in that you're a good person, so you don't do discrimination stuff and you're very inclusive, or you're a bad person and you do discrimination stuff, and and that's how we tend to have the conversation. And actually, human beings don't operate like that. We're not one end of the spectrum or the other. We tend to be somewhere in the middle on so many different topics, don't we? So what I think there is a space for compassionate challenge. It's backwards on my screen looking at it now, but you'll see above my head the words love. The word love is written there. And I think that's what we need to bring to how we manage people in the workplace anyway, but definitely to this conversation in meeting people where they are, assume positive intent. And yes, the impact may not be good and we need to deal with that as well. But how do we have these conversations where people do have different views, people do have different experiences, and do that in a way that is relatively safe and moves us in the right direction? So yes, that polarization becomes quite easy when somebody steps in, a politician, and we won't mention his name, but that gentleman from the States, who I think is probably the catalyst, not him, the person, but the fact that he opened the conversation for people who aren't on board yet, who don't quite understand it, who don't necessarily agree. Previously, they didn't have a place to speak. They didn't feel like they had any validity. So that platform's now open, so people are coming out with their views. And what I think organizations need to do, and what I certainly coach leaders to do, is to create that space where we can have those conversations. If you don't agree, let's talk about it. If you feel as though D&I has gone too far in your organization, whatever that means, I don't know, but let's talk about it. Let's have the conversation. Let's help you understand why it's important. Let's help you understand how it links to our values. Let's help you understand that it's not about you being a bad person. It is just about the society we find ourselves in and how we can make those changes to make it more fair.
And what would your advice be to leaders who want to create that kind of safe space for these discussions?
Lots of things I would say. So either bring somebody in who can help you, because these are conversations which are so vital, so important, and if not managed correctly, can be more damaging than you would have intended, or could leave things worse than they actually were in the first place. So ensure that the person who is managing those conversations with you is skilled and is able to hold that space in a way that allows everyone to share, but also protects everyone as well. So I'd say that first. And if the leader themselves wants to hold those conversations, then again, I'll suggest maybe some coaching around that. But what they'd want to be able to do is to be able to almost park their own views and park their own experiences and be able to openly listen to understand. Which is a very interesting skill, because we tend to listen to rebut, as in argue back, maybe, if you're maybe a lawyer or something, but you might listen to argue back, or you listen to try to convince somebody else to come to your side of the conversation. Listening to understand is a very, very different skill. It's hearing the person out, letting them know that their views are valid. You might not agree, and that's okay, but it's valid. So I would say it's definitely around ensuring that they've got those skills and those abilities, but really being able to take themselves and their views out of the conversation, and asking questions such as, who has a voice here? And, every time we do this in an organization, we have really, really great insights that we can share with leaders. Have you ever been discriminated against here? I think the number's 53%, it might be even more, of people who have been discriminated against in the workplace, whether it's regarding their gender or their sexuality. They don't speak up, they don't share, they don't tell their employers. They suffer in silence, they might leave, they might start having high absence rates, they might start underperforming, so they don't actually speak up. So there are lots of stories we haven't heard yet. Do you see yourself being here in the next 12 to 18 months? A really good indicator of engagement. And again, in all the organizations that we support in around these topics, there are always differences in experience and always new insights for leadership teams as well. But yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say, you could ask, do you feel like you belong? But it's about asking those tenets of inclusion and belonging. Do you have a voice? Do you see yourself being here? Have you been discriminated against? Do you feel like your opinion matters? Do you feel like you can voice an alternative opinion? So it's those types of questions that I would suggest they ask.
I love those questions because they're really, really specific, and they speak to specific challenges and everything that I am learning about inclusion. And you obviously are such an amazing expert in this, but the thing that I'm hearing from a lot of people right now is that having an idea of the sort of specific challenges that you're trying to solve is really important, isn't it?
Absolutely, because every organization is different. And I've always said this, even thinking about people strategy, just like, the two of us or three of us, I can see another person, which everybody else can't see, but just as the three of us here are all going to be very different. I have a sister, I often use my relationship with her as an example. She's my sister, we've got the same parents, so she's also a Black woman. She also works in the people space. There's about 16 months between us in terms of age, and we live around the corner from each other. I can look at the back of my back garden and ask what's for dinner. She can do the same. So we're in lots of different ways we would tick the same boxes, but we're also very different. The way we engage with the world is quite different. I'm an extrovert. She is not so much. When we go on holiday, we often joke that, we should meet on the plane, because for me, it feels like she wants to get to the airport 3 weeks beforehand. And for her, it feels like I want to get on the plane just before it takes off, which is probably true, actually, to be fair. So in lots of different ways, we're different. So it is about understanding your organization. What are the challenges here? And then, therefore, what are the solutions that we need here as well?
And that's the bit where it starts to get difficult, isn't it? Because you're looking inwards at your own organisation. And I wrote down one of the first things you said, change is hard. In all the different disciplines and all the different topics we've covered on this podcast, it keeps coming back to change is hard, and change within your own organisation is really difficult. It's easy to point to other organisations that are doing things badly or examples of where it's not so good. But as soon as you start to see or hear those examples from within your own four walls, it becomes a much trickier discussion for leaders.
It's really hard. And I think there's so many things in my mind that I want to say about this. So I think the first thing I'll say is even on a personal level, there's I don't know who's saying it is, but they say something like, when you point a finger, so if you actually point a finger, there are 3 fingers pointing back at you. So that there's that piece. So obviously pointing at other people is a lot easier, but actually what are we doing in our organization? And then also my belief, and I hold this belief to be true, and it serves me well to do that, is that in most organizations, leaders have great intentions. So when they write on their website, we're an equal opportunities employer, they mean that. That is their intention. When they have their values on their websites, that is their intention. They want a fair organization. They want an organization where they hear the best ideas and people have energy and they want to be there, and they're part of the fabric of the organization. And then on top of that, they also then apply their own experience and assume almost that is the experience of everybody else in the organization. So often, even when it's an engagement survey, any survey that you conduct in an organization, leadership will always have a much rosier view of the organization than the rest of the organization. So when we do conduct the insights programs, whether it's surveys or safe space conversation and feed that back, there is always this, wow, we didn't realize this was our organization. We thought things were a lot better. But the important thing is, yes, have that reaction because it's understandable, but how do we move to action? How do we move to addressing these issues? And how do we speak to our people and thank them for telling us, and then also tell them what it is we're going to do to address it?
And do you think some of those best employer lists and things like that, those badges that appear on websites, investors in people, those sorts of different things, is there a bit of a badge waving exercise here that says, and I wonder, there's two points to this question. You're nodding for our audio listeners. You're nodding. So there's a sort of a badge waving thing here that says, well, we've got the badge on our website, so it's all good. Job done. Brush off the hands and move on to the next challenge. And there are a lot of challenges out there for leaders, as listeners to this podcast will hear on a weekly basis. But also, does that mean that there's a challenge of people from within organisations, not necessarily the leaders and the exec team coming to people like you to come in and help them, but also sort of cries for help from within organisations, saying, well, I joined this organisation, they've got these badges on the website, but none of them are being lived up to. So there is still work to do here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of the badge waving, I was nodding in that a lot of, and not to criticize any particular badge necessarily, but a lot of the badges are self-certified. So if I'm a leader and I've got these great intentions around inclusion and the people experience and well-being and promotions, etc., I've got those great intentions, or I'm the HR person, I'm going to fill in that survey or fill in that badge application with, again, what I called earlier, a more rose-tinted view of the reality. So there's that element. So whose view are we seeking, and are we marking our own homework, which often we are. So I think that there's that element of that. And then also, I think those badges, if organizations see them as indicators maybe of movement. So if you've gone from, I don't know, bronze to silver, and your next stage is to go from silver to gold, it's about how do you ensure that that is still the case? Because yes, you could be doing things on a very general level really, really well. And what we often find in organizations is they'll have an inclusion survey or even an engagement survey, and they'll say, do you know what, we've done quite well. 75% of our people feel that they can speak up. That's amazing. That's great. That seems like a great number, right? 75%. But when you drill down by identity, so if you compare men to women, you'll see that actually it's 99% of men and only 51% of women feel that they can contribute or that their voice is heard. When you break that down in terms of people of color, you'll see that one group feels really bad and the other one feels really, really great. So those overarching numbers tell one part of the story. But when you then start to look at the less represented groups and how they feel, then you can see actually there's some gaps. And our support for organizations about how do we plug that gap? How do we bring those lowest scoring identities higher and improve the experience for them? And that's just one dimension. When you then look at the intersectional lens, which is where two identities come together, you can see that even worse still in most organizations. So if you look at women members of the LGBTQ plus community, their experience tends to be a lot lower than their two counterparts separately. If you look at women of color, if you look at women with disabilities as an example, you can see that there are disparities in experience there.
Yeah, so it becomes as we've talked about, at times of financial stress and worry or difficult times, it becomes even more important, as you said, to keep that constant level going, regardless of economic downturn and other contributing factors.
Absolutely. And most organizations will have an employee assistance program. They'll have wellbeing programs. So again, over-indexing, if we can use that terminology, on those in those moments. So people who do need the help know that it's there. People who do need that space to speak and share and communicate know that it's there as well. It's really important.
Yeah, I mean, those are all really important issues, aren't they? And what that's also got me thinking about the needs of the different communities is you've obviously done all this amazing work across different sectors. Do you find that different sectors, like say if you were comparing the way that a bank was developing its EDI program compared to a charity, do you think there are different approaches? Are different sectors approaching EDI in different ways? Do they need to approach it in different ways? What's your take on that?
Sure, thank you. I don't know whether they need to approach it in a different way because of their sector. I would say what drives how you need to approach it is the voice of your people and the experience and your insights and what you understand to be the core issues that you have, and that would come from speaking to your people and surveying, etc. So that should determine how you approach. I think what you do see definitely is that if we think about a charity and the humanitarian field, of which we support a few organizations, is that from a cultural point of view, there tends to be more of an understanding. If you think about what they do, is that they tend to be giving, they tend to be more humanistic in their approach. So you'll see that in the culture. But what you'll then see is that when you do share the feedback, when you do share the outcomes of any insights programs, it's actually even more difficult because there is that intentionality about being humanistic. There's that intentionality about doing good in the world. So hearing that they might not be doing that is quite tough, or can be quite tough for them. And then when you think about banking, again, we've got a couple of banking clients. They have premenopausal, perimenopausal. I keep losing my words. I've done well so far, actually. So I hope you'll forgive me.
Don't worry at all. Don't worry at all.
Thank you. They have the FCA and the PRA, and I've still lost the words. I can't tell you what they are, but they are governing bodies. There we go. Not quite that, but we'll use that for now. And they are developing stipulations about what they expect to see when it comes to diversity and inclusion in all organizations, all member organizations. So you'll see in banks that they're thinking about, and insurers, how do we ensure that we meet the obligations of the PRA, FCA? How do we look at governance? How do we ensure that we have our leadership team on board? So there's an element of that sort of push. Not quite legal, but again, I've forgotten the word. words. I do apologize. Regulators is back. Yeah, so in terms of regulators, there's more of a push around that.
And that's really interesting because my very much layperson's observation is sometimes when you have these very sector specific, perhaps quite scandalous cases happening, that seems to, from the outside, to drive change. So if we think of some of those hedge fund cases we've seen over the last sort of year or two, it feels like that starts to spark a flurry of activity. Do you think that is the case? Does having a high profile news story get people thinking, I really need to do something about this because I'm in this sector as well?
Yeah, there's definitely an element of I don't want to be caught out. I don't want to fall victim to this thing that's happening. I don't want to necessarily be in the news for the wrong reason. So it does spark some sort of action. And then also, if you think about how we started a lot of these conversations, it wasn't an industry specific issue, but it was the murder of George Floyd, wasn't it? That then sparked a lot of conversations around anti-racism and therefore inclusion in organizations. So I think society, industry, network, whatever the terminology is, it does spark change. And some of it is because we then sit back and reflect and think, oh my goodness, am I guilty of this? Could I be doing this? Or are we guilty of this? Can we say, and again, sitting around board tables, conversations tend to be, can we say hand on heart that this is not happening in our organization? And in most cases, it's like, well, no, we can't say that. Oh my goodness, let's go do something about it. So yeah, you do see those stories prompting action.
One of the questions that sort of came up today, and there's a couple of employers involved, I guess, is you mentioned as well, the name who should not be mentioned from across the pond, politician, who is, and you also mentioned Elon Musk. And I just wondered, one of the topic of conversations we're having at the moment about safe spaces and places where people can be and exist is social media. And social media is becoming even more polarized at the moment. And I guess one of those platforms, or the platform that comes up for discussion most on this podcast, and certainly amongst Zoe and I, is Twitter, now X, and that is becoming a bit of a space. What do you think about the sort of the safe spaces outside of organisations where people can start to share their experiences with each other? Is that a contributing factor that those spaces just don't feel safe for, many minorities at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great question. And the answer to that, I don't know. But what I can say is that, I guess, as you described that piece around potentially having a situation at work which is not very inclusive, and it might be something as seemingly inconspicuous as microaggressions, and I say seemingly because it still hurts, to outright, a behavior that we know is wrong, and we know it still happens because we see it in employment tribunals all the time. It still happens. So if you're in that situation and then you're on social media and you're scrolling or you're commenting, and then you see the responses that come back, and I've had that myself, and I've got quite thick skin because I'm a coach and the work that I do, etc. But I remember I was telling someone the other day, I posted something on TikTok, and it was just, one, I don't know why I'm trying to be young, but anyway, I thought I would do that. And it was just a thank you 2023, and just some highlights of the year and awards and things I'd been to, etc. And some person I don't even know just responded something like, well, that only happened because you've probably got loads of handouts because you're Black and blah, blah, blah. And it was quite horrible. I thought, oh my gosh, that's awful. So I guess if we're describing that as people's experiences as well, you can then start to see a lot of the data that's around actually the impact of discrimination on people's mental health. So there's a lot around the impact of sexism on mental health, the impact of racism on mental health, the impact on homophobia on mental health. And a lot of that is because it's not just in one space, it's in lots of different spaces in lots of different ways. It can be showing up to someone, you're thinking, wow, why am I the only woman in the room? It could be a comment around, oh, all right, darling, make us some tea, seems inconspicuous, but given all the other stuff that woman has potentially been through, or even on that day, that becomes the thing that then takes them to a bad place. And And that's why often you'll find groups either in the workplace or outside of the workplace setting up affinity groups. So it's, groups of women, and we talk about women's stuff, and we whatever it is that we need to talk about, groups for people of color, and we're able to talk about our experiences, groups for the LGBTQ plus community, which often people don't understand. They're like, well, they're excluding us because they've got a group just for women. What about the men? Or they've got a group just for people of color. What about white people? And you hear that, but what you've just described, Paul, is part of the reason why these groups form, because then they become people's safe spaces.
Yeah. And we were saying, we've said in several conversations actually recently that those spaces are disappearing from online. They're still there. They might be in WhatsApp, or they might be somewhere that's private, but they're disappearing from those public spaces because those public spaces are just becoming places where people don't feel that they can get that support.
Yeah. And we're, again, in that same conversation about that TikTok thing, and there's something on X as well, as I'll call it now, a similar experience on X as well. And someone made a really good point to me, which was, obviously, if you can do it, try not to leave those spaces, because if we leave, and I said to my team, right, we're not using X anymore, and blah, 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 as a lot of organizations did. But I am reflecting on that now, because if we start leaving, if people who do have a different voice, if people who are inclusive, if people have even just a different perspective, and that's fine, are leaving, then those places become even more dangerous, because the only voices that are there are potentially the voices that are counter to what we're talking about. And if you want to make change, which I absolutely do, I want to make the world a more inclusive place and spread more love. So if you want to do that, then speaking to people who already share that view is lovely and great and affirming, but you're not going to necessarily change. And it's only by speaking to those who have a different view in a respectful way, in a compassionately challenging way, that's when you start to make those changes. And otherwise it becomes a very them and us, and they're scary and too woke, and then we're like, they're scary and discriminatory. But yeah, not quite reality, I don't think.
Yeah, and it sort of all links together, doesn't it? Because you're right, if organisations decide to leave those spaces because of how they're being managed, then really important things like employer branding and things like that, where, certainly 5-10 years ago, it was really, really important for brands to be all over social media to talk about the experience of coming and working for our organisation. Yeah. And if that's disappearing, then what that's going to lead to is new blood, new young people coming into organisations who aren't seeing that, because big businesses and organisations and charities have left those spaces behind. Yeah. So it comes back to that point about how organisations are recruiting diversity into the workplace.
Yeah, and I think just to loop back a little bit into the X conversation. Sorry, Elon, we're talking about the X conversation specifically. I think for organizations, I was speaking more from an individual point of view. I think for organizations, it is about speaking to their people. I think with anything, speak to your people. I mean, if your people are absolutely, no, we can't be anywhere near it, it's just shocking, it's terrible, then you do need to heed that as well, and think about that. But I think from a personal point of view, definitely for me, I haven't done it yet because I do not have a thick skin at all when it comes to direct meanness. But I'm thinking about how I go about doing that, but put my armor on first and then do it. But anyway, back to recruitment. So nice swerve back into recruitment and how organizations are recruiting a diverse range of people. The first thing I'll say is that if you always do what you've always done, you're going to get the same results. So in other words, you need to do something differently. And it always has to start with your why. So back to your organizational outcomes, back to your why around your values and why you want to be a more inclusive and diverse organization, having that real understanding, because there is a lot of I guess conversation out there about box ticking and people feeling as though, oh, look, another organization has put a black or brown person or woman as a CEO or whatever it is on their website. But is that the reality? Are they box ticking? So people are quite wary of organizations potentially playing lip service. So it always has to go back to your why. And that's important for you as an organization, because then that will then determine how you approach this and who you work with and how you make that happen. It's also important for your recruitment team and your managers to understand the why as well, because a lot of naysaying, if we're going to call it that, is just because they don't understand why. Are we box ticking? Is this wokeness gone mad? Is this political correctness gone mad? But if we're able to connect it to our why, our organizational outcomes, our values, and help our leaders see why, then it's really important. Then the rest of it, that's probably the hardest part. The rest of it, to be honest, is just easy. I'll say that because obviously that's what we do for a living. But it's understanding where you're advertising. It's looking at, first of all, how do you design your job? So is it that, I don't know, I'm going to make up some names. Trevor's left finance now, so we need to replace the role exactly the same as we had it, and Trevor was great, so let's just look for someone like Trevor and then recruit him. Or are we thinking, so Trevor's left, it's a shame, we're going to talk to him and understand why and see what we can do differently, but if he decides to leave, actually what can we do differently with this role? What's missing in the team? How can we bring in, AI? How can we bring in a different way of thinking? How can we bring in collaboration with different teams? So almost reimagining those roles. Then when it comes to, so that's job design, but also thinking, can it be done part-time, as an example? Does it have to be that full-time FTE? Can we have a job share in here? All these questions that we can ask ourselves about the art of the possible. Then it comes to things like, job descriptions, what language are we using? Is it very masculine or not? Will it put people off? Are we expecting that somebody has a first-class degree from Oxford? Do they really need that? Maybe there are some jobs out there that you do absolutely need to have that. Maybe if we can justify it, great, but most jobs probably not. So how do we then expand the pool that we're looking for from, and then who we're working with agencies wise to ensure that we bring that diverse? So many things I could talk to you about it for days, really. But the first piece I would say is that understanding the why, understanding how it connects to delivering what the organization needs, and then understand that if you do what you've always done, you're going to get the same results. So really reimagine the full process.
It's absolutely the case. I remember, if you needed to recruit someone, you'd go to the shared drive, you'd find the old job description, you'd give it the once over and you'd republish it. Yeah. And then you'd wonder why you ended up with somebody who was exactly like the last person you hired. I mean, it's just it's not rocket science, is it? But it is a bit of brain surgery, perhaps.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's all brilliant advice. Thank you, Aggie. So what would your final closing thought be for any leaders out there who are thinking, I really need to move forward on EDI, but we've got so much going on, the economic climate is so challenging. You talked earlier about commitment. What is a really important thing that a leader could do tomorrow to start really renewing that commitment to EDI?
Yeah, I would say I'd ask them a question, actually, and ask them to reflect on a time when they didn't belong. It may be a new team they joined, it may be a school, it may be a new football team or sports team, and maybe they moved to a new neighborhood, a time when they didn't belong. And most of us have that. And I ask those questions to leadership team all the time, and hundreds of people. I've only had one person who said, actually, I've belonged everywhere. I'm like, that's amazing. That's brilliant for you. Let's make sure we do that that's amazing. We want that for everyone, right? So that's great for them. But I'd ask them, think about a time when you didn't belong. What was going on for you? How did you show up? Did you show up as yourself? Did you bring your best ideas? Did your people around you see the best of you and who you are? Often people talk about maybe shrinking themselves a little bit, or the opposite, just almost being more overt than they really are. They'll talk about maybe leaving or not showing up, or definitely not showing up as their best. And then also ask yourself, what could people around you have done to make you feel more included in that situation? And then a last question would be, the people around you, do you think they realize that you felt like this? And more often than not, they'll say, no, they probably didn't. I didn't speak up. I didn't share. I didn't say anything. I just shrunk myself, or I just left, or I just showed up and not really showed up. I showed up as who I was. So the lessons from that are, one, that feeling of belonging is a human experience. It's not just the women or the people of color or the LGBTQ plus community. It's a human experience that everyone experiences and wants to experience, that belonging piece. when you don't belong, you don't show up as your best self. So if they think about their teams and then their wider organization, if there are people who are there who aren't feeling included, they're not showing up as their best selves. We're not getting their best ideas. We're not getting their best performance necessarily. And then two more. Then the other one around what could people have done to make you feel included. Are we doing that? Are we training our people to do that for their colleagues? Are we raising awareness around these issues so people can do that for each other? And then lastly, did the people realize, maybe we don't realize we're not including people ourselves as individuals, as leaders, as organizations as well. So you asked for one thing. I'll remix it a little bit. It's like 1 point A, B, C, D. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. So much great insight there. Thank you, Aggie. Well, thank you so much for today. It's just been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I can really hear that depth of experience that you offer to everyone you've worked with through the stories you've told and the experiences you've shared. So any organisation that gets to work with you is extremely lucky. So please do look out for Aggie. Aggie, where can people come and find you if they want to work with you?
Sure. Thank you, Zoe. So I'm on LinkedIn. So Aggie Mutuma. I'm the only one. Surprise, surprise. So I'm on LinkedIn. So find me there. And then Mahogany Inclusion Partners.com is our website. So you can either click on the contact us button and you can get through to us. And then when I get brave and put my armor on, you'll see me on TikTok, back on TikTok as well.
We'll look forward to it. And we'll put the link to your website in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Aggie. It's been a joy. And please do keep in touch, and we'd love to talk to you again sometime in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I've loved it. Thank you.
Thank you to Aggie for joining us on the podcast. What a wonderful discussion with someone who is very much at the forefront of EDI.
We'll share all of her contact details. I know Aggie said them at the end of the podcast, at the end of the recording, so we'll share them all in the show notes so you can get in touch with her, because as we said in the intro, there's really still a lot of work to do. As always, though, we really do appreciate that you've listened all the way through to the end of this episode. Thank you so much. You can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us. It really does help us to reach more people. So if you've enjoyed what you've heard today, please do share us with a friend.
Thank you so much for listening today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks with a brand new episode of Starts at the Top.
See you then, and bye for now.
See you next time.